This is the closest thing I've got to a valuable, said Mrs. White sadly. She handed Mr. Body a lottery ticket. If I win, it'll be worth $1 million. Oh, now, Mrs. White, scolded Mr. Body. How many times have I told you that it is foolish to enter the lottery? Why, the odds of winning are less than the odds of being struck by lightning. Just then a bolt of lightning shrieked through the dark side outside, hit the top of the gazebo. Well, he said, lightning never strikes twice. A second bolt hit the gazebo in the exact same place. All right, Mr. Body said, taking the ticket. I'll put it in the safe. Maybe you're onto something after all. He added the ticket to the pile of valuables. Then he reached into his pants pocket. I almost forgot. Petty cash. He pulled out 10 packets of cash. Each packet contains $100,000 bills. But that's $1 million, said Mrs. White with a gasp. Yes, said Body. I always like to have a little money around the mansion. Saves me a trip to the bank. What about you, Professor? I don't mind going to the bank. No, I meant, do you have any valuables to lock up? Just one. Professor Plum handed Mr. Body a ballpoint pen. Mr. Body looked at the pen for a moment, turning red. Professor, you are sure you've remembered what we're talking about? Plum scratched his head with a worried frown. Was it important? Yes, very. We're locking up our valuables. Plum nodded at the pen in Body's hand. It may not look like much, but I'll wager that pen is worth more than any of the other valuables put together. It's one of my newest and greatest inventions. Ah, said all the guests at once. Ah, added Mr. Body, looking at the pen more closely. What does it do? It writes, said the proud professor. Mr. Body eyed the professor strangely. Yes, well, that's not groundbreaking, but it writes by itself, exclaimed Plum. He took the pen. Here, I'll show you. He took out a blank piece of paper and wrote, Mr. Body is a... He paused. Now, let's say I get stuck. I just press this little red button on the top of the pen and the pen began to move by itself in an attractive looping style. The pen added the word nitty. See, Mr. Body is a ninny. That makes sense, right? All of the guests clapped, except for Mr. Body, who was frowning. Suddenly the pen began to move. Again. Said Plum. That's not supposed to happen. The pen now wrote, Mrs. Peacock is a fuss budget. How cruel, said Mrs. Peacock. Miss Scarlet is a flirt, added the pen. Mr. Green is a bully, and Mrs. White is a... Plum grabbed the pen before it could write any more. Obviously, there are still a few bugs in the system which I have to work out, but it doesn't matter, said Mr. Body, cutting him off. There's no time for this now. We must secure all the valuables at once. A wave of rain began to fall. The lights flickered and went out. They came back on again almost instantly. You see, no time to lose, said Mr. Body. As you all must realize, Kitty Lyons is the world's greatest blurber. She moves fast and silently, like an invisible cat. Why, she's so hard to spot she could be on the very premise already, and we'd never know. And if the lights blow, we'll be completely helpless. Suddenly, the pen in Plum's hand began to move again. It scrawled, "Stop talking and put the valuables in the safe." "Right," agreed Body. There was a sound of breaking glass. "Danger!" The pen wrote on the wall. "So it can levitate?" "Well, I guess it would have to have at least some thrust ability or some kind of lift ability on its own to stay upright and be able to write, because that's how pens work. But still, enough to go all the way up and be like on the wall sideways. That would have to have an enormous amount of thrust. Anywho, "Mr. Body, I think we have company," said Mrs. White. "You're just realizing that now?" asked the confused Professor Plum. No, said Mr. White. "I mean, besides the usual guests." Outside the lounge, the footsteps creaked across the old wooden floorboards, and then a third bolt of lightning struck. This one hit one of the mansion's 12 gables. The lights flickered again, only this time they didn't come back on. In the darkness, the guests heard the lounge door open. There was a thwack, a scream or two, lots of running around, then the sound of the door locking. More running around, then another thwack, and another, and another, and another. 3 hours later. Professor Plum woke up with a terrible headache. "Why is it so dark in here?" he wondered. Then he realized his eyes were closed. He opened his eyes, and a new puzzle presented itself. Where was he? He peered around the room, and saw he was in the basement of Body's mansion. Problem solved. Then a third problem occurred to him. What was he doing in the basement of Body's mansion? "I don't remember coming down here," he thought. "Well, no matter, I'll go back upstairs." He tried to move. He couldn't. It seemed that his arms and legs were tied. He was tied so tightly that he could barely move his head. "This is awful," he said. He said it aloud, but it came out something more like Professor Plum had just had another realization. He was gagged. Just then, he saw something moving on the basement wall a few feet away. His self-writing pen. "Hello, Professor," the pen wrote. "Hello," he cried in a gargled voice. "What's going on?" "You and all the other guests are all tied up," the pen wrote. "The other guests?" Plum tried to turn his head, but he couldn't see. But it was true. All the guests were tied together in a bunch. Then there were muffled groans from all sides. Apparently the other guests were also starting to revive. "Who did this?" Plum asked in a muffled voice. "What?" wrote the pen. Plum repeated the question. The pen began to write again. "The person who tied you up is named..." The pen kept moving, but no more letters appeared. It had run out of ink. They just don't make pens like they used to. More muffled groans from the other guests. It sounded like everyone else was gagged as well, but Plum was able to communicate a little bit. First, a voice sounded like Miss Scarlet or Mrs. Peacock if anyone had a knife so he or she could cut them all free. From the other side of Plum, another voice that sounded like Miss Scarlet or Miss Peacock answered. This voice said she had the knife, but couldn't move her hands to use it. Then a gargled voice suggested that they all try to make their way up the stairs. The voice sounded to Plum like Colonel Mustard or Plum himself. From the other side of Plum, another voice said this was a great idea. It sounded like Green or Colonel Mustard. The tied-up guests began to struggle forward with tiny, shuffled steps. The whole group made it to the steps. On the count of 3, the gargled voice said a gargled voice. 1, 2, 3, chanted the muffled voices of the group. Then they all said, hop! And the whole bunch of tied-up guests hopped as one up onto the first stair. Hop! They made it up the second stair. Hop! The third. In a few minutes they were only one step away from freedom. The group rested for a moment. Then the group began counting again. 1, 2, after which all but one of the group said, 3, hop! They hopped. The one member of the group who didn't say this was Professor Plum. What Professor Plum said was, oh dear, would you believe it? I've forgotten what comes after 3. He also forgot to hop. As a result, the group tripped and rolled back down the stairs. There were gargled screams, then silence. A few minutes later, one of the group announced she had some matches in her pocket. It sounded like Mrs. White or Mrs. Peacock. No thanks, Plum said. I don't smoke. But the guests ignored him. They struggled to get out the matches. There was the sound of a match being struck and a muffled curse. The sound of another match being struck. This one was lit. The guest explained that she was going to try to burn the rope. Moments later, Professor Plum smelled smoke. That was just before the other guests had succeeded in burning through the rope. Unfortunately, by then, Plum had forgotten the plan. Thinking quickly, he tried to save the day by rolling over and over on the floor to put the fire out. As the whole pile of guests rolled over and across the basement floor, Mr. Body got terribly smushed. It took him several minutes to regain consciousness. Now what? Asked a muffled voice. Looks like we're stuck here for good, answered another gargled voice. Another one of the guests called out in a gargled voice, I think there are only 6 of us. Isn't that enough? Asked Plum. It means, a voice continued, that one of us is missing. The gargled voice said to Plum, like Miss Scarlet, Mrs. Peacock, or his mother. And whoever is missing, said the second gargled voice, they must have something to do with taking our valuables and robbing us. I've only got one question, said Plum. What's that? Asked all the gargled voices at once. Plum said, could you repeat what you just said? Name the thief. Well, like a lot of these cases, the best way to figure out who done it is to find out who was there firsthand. Okay, so. But before I explain my thought process to you guys, I want you guys to post down in the comments who you think the thief is, so we can compare notes and stuff like that. Alright. Well, first things first, we know it wasn't Professor Plum because we were with him the whole time. So, the best way to figure out who the thief is to go back to when all this started, which would be right here. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, first of all, I think it's safe to say that there's at least 2 of the girl characters there, because I feel like there was a girl because when Mr. Plum was tied up, there was a girl on both sides of him, so there has to be at least 2 girl characters there. And he said both times that the girl voice on either side of him sounded like Miss Scarlet or Miss Peacock. So obviously Miss Scarlet and Miss Peacock have to be the ones on either side of him. And I feel like later on the line he also mentioned someone sounding like Miss White or Miss Scarlet, so I feel like Miss White has to be in the room too. So I get the feeling the thief is one of the fellas. We know it isn't Mr. Body because they mentioned Mr. Body getting squished. And we know that Colonel Mustard is a part of the group because he mentions one of the guys sounding like Colonel Mustard. And then he also mentions someone sounding like Mr. Green. So I'm guessing that Mr. Green is also a part of the group. But who did that leave? Hold on, let me look at my notebook here. Okay, so that would leave us with no suspects. Unless we are to assume that, you know, Kitty was the actual one that tied them all up. But I feel like that would be too easy. Like, there would be no evidence to support the fact that, hey, they were all tied up by Kitty. Because we don't even see Kitty's character any in the book, so I feel like it would just be a throwaway to have her be the one that tied them up and stuff. But then again, there isn't a real way to confirm the people that are there aside from, hey, they sound like this person. So I'm gonna have to go with my gut. Well, unless if you take away the fact that they say that Mr. Body gets squished, there's really no mention of him in that scene. So I guess you could take away from that and say that Mr. Body is the one that did all of this. Or you could say that Mr. Body sounds like one of the other guys. Like, you could say that Mr. Body sounds like Colonel Mustard or sounds like Mr. Green. And then say either Colonel Mustard or Mr. Green is the one that did it. But personally, that's all I can put together here. So, post your thoughts down below in the comment section, and next, I am going to read the solution. Solution. Mrs. White. Okay. How? First of all, we need to know that Plum is only absent-minded. He was certainly present physically, so the missing guest can't be Plum. Right? Then a voice that sounded like Miss Scarlet or Mrs. Peacock called out, and a voice that sounded like Miss Scarlet or Mrs. Peacock answered. That accounts for Mrs. Scarlet and Mrs. Peacock. Miss Scarlet and Mrs. Peacock. Yes. A voice that suggests the guests climb the stairs sounded to Plum like Colonel Mustard or Plum himself. It should be obvious to everyone, but Plum that this must be the Colonel. So when Mr. Green or Mustard answered the Colonel, it must have been Mr. Green. Right. Mr. Body is the sixth person and is never a suspect. That means the missing person is Mrs. White. By the way, Mrs. White didn't act alone. She served as an accomplice to the famous escaped cat burglar, Kitty Lyon. But Kitty double-crossed her and made off with the valuables herself. Still penniless and bitter, Mrs. White returned to the mansion and her duties as Mr. Body's maid. A few hours after that, she set the guests free. There was a huge missed opportunity here. They go on and on about how great this cat burglar is, and then they barely have her be in the actual solution to the mystery at all. Like, we're just told that Mrs. White is her accomplice. How cool would it have been if, instead of the magic pen, Kitty herself was actually guarding the tied-up people while Mrs. White was gathering the items? Not only would that give us more chance for evidence to present that would present the fact that, hey, Mrs. White isn't actually in the room with them, but also it would give us a chance to really get to know this character, which is basically committing the crime. So, yeah, I feel like they hyped up this great villain that they didn't even use all that much. But maybe things will be better in this next mystery, which we have right here, which is cloning around. Bang, boom, zip, zap, splat, crunch, bonk, bing. Mrs. Peacock was on her way to the billiard room when she heard these strange sounds coming from the conservatory. She entered cautiously and saw a large contraption that looked like a cross between an automatic pitching machine and a movie camera. The machine was humming quietly. The strange sounds were coming from Professor Plum, who was talking to himself as he worked. Tick-tock, kerplink, kerplunk, Plum said as he tightened a bolt with the wrench. Mrs. Peacock cleared her throat. Plum looked up, startled. "What is that?" "What is that?" she asked. "A wrench," said Plum, looking at the tool in his hand. No. Mrs. Peacock had pointed. That's your pointer finger," explained the professor. "But I'm busy now. You're going to have to figure out some of these questions by yourself." "No! The machine! That machine!" "Ah," said the professor, smiled proudly. "This is a new invention of mine. Amazing, really. Would you believe that this device will make someone instantly smarter?" "No," said Mrs. Peacock. inspected the machine closely. I would not believe it. Well then, said Plum, allow me to demonstrate. Stand over here. He placed her in front of the machine's pitching arm and pressed a button. The machine whirled. Its metal hand closed around a tennis ball, lifted it slowly, and flung it at Mrs. Peacock's head. She screamed and ducked. The ball sailed out the window and landed right in the middle of Mr. Green's tennis match against Miss Scarlet. Back in the conservatory, Mrs. Peacock was fuming. Is this your idea of a joke, Professor? Sorry, said Plum. I hit the wrong button, you see. This machine, will also serve tennis balls. I designed that part to help Mr. Body improve his game. He pressed another button. The machine whirled again. Now it began projecting a film on the conservatory wall. The film showed a little baby taking a bath. That's me, cried Plum. Age 2. Mrs. Peacock let out an impatient sigh and headed for the door. Wait! Cried Plum. I hit the wrong button. Again, you see, the machine doubles as a movie projector. But it really works. Watch! He pressed a third button. Nothing happened. Once more, Mrs. Peacock started for the door. Once more, Professor Plum begged her to stay. When that didn't work, he tripped her. The machine will work perfectly this time. I promise you, he said. Now, how much smarter would you like to be? Shall we say 5 times smarter? Good. He hurriedly set the dial to 5, then zapped Mrs. Peacock with a purple beam of light. All right, said Plum, as he strode around the room. Let's give you a little test, shall we see? Number 1. What's the cattle... What is the capital of North Kentucky? Number 2. What is the speed of light divided by the speed of ketchup when poured from a bottle? Number 3. What was Alvin von Koch's theory of time? He paused. Mrs. Peacock didn't answer. I know they're difficult questions, but now that you're 5 times smarter, they should seem like a snap for you, right? Plum turned to face his fellow guest. Then he turned again, and again, and again. There were now 6 identical peacocks Mrs. Peacocks standing in the room. All 6 Mrs. Peacocks looked outraged. You fool! One of the 6 Mrs. Peacocks cried, looking around at the other Mrs. Peacocks in terror. What have you done? Professor Plum began to laugh heartily. What's so funny? Demanded all of the Mrs. Peacocks. I'm sorry, I just thought of a silly joke. What did one chicken say to the other? The furious look on the faces of all 6 peacocks stopped Plum in mid-sentence. Sorry. Then a look of horror passed across his own face. What is it? Asked one of the Mrs. Peacocks. I just remembered something, he began timidly. This isn't my intelligence multiplying machine at all. It's not? Asked another one of the peacocks. What is it then? It's my cloning machine. Your cloning machine? Asked a third Mrs. Peacock. Yes, it makes duplicates of anyone I aim the beam at. But there's no cause for alarm. The professor scratched his head. I just wish I could remember why I decided never to use this thing. 5 of the Mrs. Peacocks now began arming themselves with weapons. They moved slowly toward Plum and the real Mrs. Peacock. The real Mrs. Peacock. "Ah, yes, said Plum. "Now I've got it. You see, there's a bug in the machine. The clones turn out to be identical to the original in every respect except one. They're crazed killers." Except they're crazed killers? Excuse me for being blunt here, Professor Plum, but everyone in this freaking mansion is a crazed killer at one point or another. Or a thief. So, I don't think that's an exception. I think that's an inclusion. The real Mrs. Peacock screamed and ran from the room. "I wonder what got into her," said Plum. Then he glanced at the clones, who were almost upon him. That jogged his memory. He screamed and ran out of the room as well. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Mr. Body was filling a cereal bowl with sugar. Then he added 1 cereal flake and poured in the milk. He murmured happily as he began to eat. "How about a little sugar with your cereal?" teased Mrs. Peacock as she entered the room. "Or should I say, how about a little cereal with your sugar?" "I admit I like it sweet," said Body with a grin. "Do you want some?" "Love some," said Mrs. Peacock, moving closer. Just then a second Mrs. Peacock appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Peacock," said Mr. Body, "what a coincidence! I was just talking to you." Then his head swiveled rapidly back and forth between the 2 peacocks. Finally his head stopped, because he now saw that the second Mrs. Peacock was holding a revolver. His head swiveled one more time, and he saw that the first Mrs. Peacock wasn't eating cereal. Instead, she had taken out a knife. She was only inches away. "Stand back!" he yelled, or I'll... He looked down at the weapon in his hand. It was a spoon. He ran screaming from the room with both Mrs. Peacocks racing after him. Mr. Body almost ran smack into Mrs. Scarlet, who was running in the other way. There were 2 peacocks after her. 2 Mrs. Peacocks after her as well. Mrs. Scarlet sprinted into the ballroom and slammed the door shut. A peacock feather was sticking out through the crack in the door. It tickled Mrs. Scarlet's cheek as it slowly withdrew. Then the clones started battering down the door. Miss Scarlet began barricading the door with furniture. Then the door was secure. When the door was secure, she looked around. The ballroom had 4 doors. She ran from door to door, locking each one, except she didn't get to the 4th door in time. It opened, and in walked Mrs. Peacock. She was gasping for breath. "Don't be frightened," she said. "I'm the real Mrs. Peacock, and I'm in as much danger as you are." "You see, Professor Plum—" I know, said Mrs. Scarlet, swooning into the love seat. "Lock the door." But before Mrs. Peacock could lock the door, Miss Scarlet was on her feet again. Wait a minute. How do I know you're not... Wait a minute. How do I know you're the real Peacock and not some dirty liar? Don't say dirty, said Mrs. Peacock, horrified. "That's vulgar and rude." Miss Scarlet sank back into the love seat. Phew! For a moment there I didn't trust you. Mrs. Peacock reached down in to lock the door, but the door flew open just before she could turn the latch. A second Mrs. Peacock burst into the room. She's lying, said the second Mrs. Peacock. I'm the real one. So am I, said the third one, who had walked in behind her. Don't listen to them, said the first Mrs. Peacock, moving to Scarlet's side. I won't, said Miss Scarlet. I know you're the real one because I can't believe you would lie like that, interrupted the second Mrs. Peacock, staring at the first Mrs. Peacock. That is so rude. You're lying too, said the third Mrs. Peacock. What horrible manners. Uh-oh, said Miss Scarlet. She said it for two reasons. Reason number one, since all three peacocks were prim and prissy, she no longer knew for sure who was telling the truth. Reason number two, the first peacock had just placed the rope around her neck. Oh my. And I don't think she's doing it to make a DIY choker. Well, she is, but not in the fashion sense way. Miss Scarlet slid down out of the loop of the rope. She also slid off the love seat. You're all lying, she screamed. She ran for the door to open the door, all three clones after her. They all got to the door at the same time, which meant they crashed into each other and fell to the door. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peacock was chasing Mr. Green and Colonel Mustard through the secret passageway from the study to the kitchen. Mrs. Peacock was gaining on them, her hands stretched toward Mr. Green. She lunged, I think. But just then Mr. Green saw that his shoelace was untied, and he bent down to tie it. Mrs. Peacock sailed over his head with a crash. Colonel Mustard tripped over her and was sent sprawling to the floor. All three scrambled to their feet. Mrs. Peacock raised the lead pipe, bringing it down swiftly over Mr. Green's head. But luckily for Mr. Green, he now saw that his other shoelace had come untied. He bent down to tie it. Thanks to his untied shoe, he missed the blow by a foot. Colonel Mustard and Mr. Green both screamed and ran through the passageway and into the kitchen. The peacock clone was in hot pursuit. Meanwhile, Professor Plum and the other guests had gathered in the conservatory. You've got to do something, said Mr. Body as Professor Plum paced up and down. I am doing something, said the professor. I'm pacing. You must do something to stop these killer clones, exclaimed Body. Ah, said Plum. That's a little more difficult. We're doomed, said Mrs. White, nervously pulling on her hair. Don't say that, cried Miss Scarlet, also pulling nervously on Mrs. White's hair. I don't think the situation is too serious, said Plum. The worst that could happen is that the clones will kill us. Just then the door opened and Mr. Green raced in. Save me! Save me! He yelled. Colonel Mustard ran in after him. That's odd, said Plum. Why would Mr. Green be running from the Colonel? You blockhead! He wasn't running from me, said Mustard. He was running from me, said Mrs. Peacock as she walked into the room. Or was it me? Said the second Mrs. Peacock. Or me, or me, or me. The room was now crowded with Mrs. Peacocks. 6 of them, said Plum in a quivering voice as the 6 peacocks began to move slowly forward. There's got to be some way to reverse what you've done, said Mustard, slowly backing up. Reverse, said Plum. That's it! He ran to his contraption and he pointed it at the 6 peacocks. Don't take another step, or I'll press the reverse button. You'll be erased forever. The 6 peacocks paused, eyeing him warningly. What are you waiting for, Plum? Said Mr. Green. He's waiting because he doesn't know which of us to erase, said one Mrs. Peacock. There's no way to tell, said another. Plum, how do we tell? Asked Miss Scarlet. Plum scratched his head. Well, let's see. Which of these 6 peacocks has a weapon? All 6 peacocks held up both hands. Every hand was empty. They had all ditched their weapons. Suddenly Plum slapped his forehead. I just remembered something, he cried. There are 2 bugs in my cloning machine, not 1. Terrific, said Mrs. White without enthusiasm. The clones turn out to be crazed killers, continued Plum. But they also have another flaw. The clones always lie. Thank goodness, said one of the peacocks with a broad smile. That proves I'm the real peacock. I always tell the truth. That's a lie, insisted the other 5. How does this help us? Said Mrs. White. We just have to ask the right question, said Mr. Body. He thought for a moment. Then he asked, which one of you is real? I am, answered all 6. Which one of you always mind her manners? Asked Colonel Mustard. I do, answered all 6 again. State your name, ordered Mr. Green. Mrs. Peacock, answered all 6 peacocks at once. I don't think this is getting anywhere, said Miss Scarlet. There's got to be a question we can ask that will tell us who is who. Who's who? Said Mr. Body. There isn't, said Mustard. I'm afraid we'll have to zap all of them. Right, said Plum, aiming his machine. Wait, cried Mrs. White. I know what question to ask. What question should the guests ask to find the real Mrs. Peacock? What do you guys think? Because right now my brain is just like, it's just like stumped. It's just like, I don't know. I am completely stumped. I don't know what question they're supposed to ask. Because we know that the clones are they're polite too, like the original Mrs. Peacock. Maybe if I backtrack some, I'll find something. Let's see here. I know. I know what they can ask her. They can ask her what Mr. Green told her the machine would do. Only the original Mrs. Peacock would know what the machine was supposed to do, or what supposedly it was supposed to do in the beginning, because only she was there for that. That's my theory anyway. Post your thoughts down below in the comment section, because I'm just like grasping at straws here. So I'm gonna read the solution. So quick pause and type your thoughts down in the comment section, and I'll read the solution. Okay, here's the solution. Solution. What's 2 plus 2? Will work just fine. Since only the real Mrs. Peacock will answer 4, the clones will all lie and make up some other answer. In fact, the guests can ask any simple factual question and solve the mystery. What? Could the clones have really lied the whole time? That whole time? It just seems like they wouldn't be able to lie that whole time. But, anyway, whatever. That's the solution to the mystery. And I think we're going to end the video here. So, I will see you guys next time on personal readings and dramatic stories. Bye-bye.